You know that feeling when you're under the hood of your car, three knuckles deep in what should be a simple repair, and you hear that first rumble of thunder? That's when you realize Mother Nature doesn't give a damn about your schedule. Now imagine you're not in your driveway with a garage 20 feet away. You're 5 miles up a mountain trail or deep in state forest land, or maybe just taking what was supposed to be a quick walk through the back 40. The sky's been looking a little iffy all day, sure, but you've seen worse. Hell, you've worked through worse. Then it happens. That low, serious rumble that makes your gut tighten. The kind that doesn't sound like the afternoon pop-up showers you remember from summer baseball games. This one means business. Welcome to the moment when everything changes. When the sky turns serious. I've talked to enough men who've lived through this exact scenario. From Vietnam vets who got caught in monsoons, to ranchers who've weathered prairie storms that could strip paint. They all tell you the same thing. There's a split second when you stop being a tourist in nature and start being prey to it. 1 minute you're enjoying the fresh air, maybe thinking about that project waiting in the workshop, or wondering if the grandkids would get a kick out of this hiking trail. The next minute you're calculating distances, wind speed, and whether that stand of trees up ahead offers any real protection or just the illusion of it. The difference between men who make it home with a good story and men who don't often comes down to what happens in that first 60 seconds after they realize they're in trouble. See, most folks today have never been more than 100 yards from climate control. We've got weather apps that tell us exactly when the rain's coming, down to the minute. We've got Gore-Tex and space-age synthetics and gear that costs more than your first car. We drive from heated garage to heated office, and if we get caught in a downpour, we duck into the nearest Starbucks until it passes. But strip all that away, put a man out where his grandfather might have found himself on any given workday, and you quickly separate the wheat from the chaff. The lost art of weather sense. My dad could smell rain coming 3 hours before the first cloud showed up. Could feel it in his bones, he'd say, and I used to think that was just old-timer talk. Turns out he was reading a dozen different signals that most of us have forgotten how to recognize. The way birds suddenly go quiet, how the leaves on certain trees start showing their undersides, the particular quality of stillness that settles over everything right before the atmosphere decides to cut loose. These weren't mysteries to men who spent their working lives outdoors. A farmer who couldn't read weather was a farmer who'd lose his crop. A logger who ignored the signs might find himself trying to navigate muddy logging roads in a downpour, miles from the nearest help. A traveling salesman who didn't pay attention might end up stuck in his car for hours while flash floods turned familiar roads into rivers. They learned to read the sky like we read a blueprint, not because they were outdoorsmen or survivalists, just because knowing could save your hide and not knowing could cost you everything. When experience beats equipment, here's what gets interesting about our story. When that storm rolls in and you realize you're not making it back to the truck before it hits, all your fancy gear suddenly becomes secondary to what's between your ears. I remember talking to an old Marine, served in Korea, spent 2 tours walking mountains that made the Appalachians look like speed bumps. He told me about a night when his unit got caught in a storm that lasted 18 hours. Temperature dropped 40 degrees, rain came down like God was emptying buckets, and they were still 12 miles from base. We had ponchos, he said, and that was about it. No Gore-Tex, no ultralight this or moisture wicking that. Just canvas, wool, and whatever we could scrounge from the landscape. Half his unit spent that night shivering in whatever shelter they could cobble together. The other half, the guys who'd grown up on farms or in logging camps, got to work building something that would actually keep them alive until morning. Guess which group walked out under their own power? The difference wasn't gear, it was knowledge. The kind of practical, hard-won understanding that comes from growing up in a world where knowing how to stay warm and dry wasn't a hobby, it was a survival skill. Why this matters now? You might be thinking, well, that's interesting history, but when am I ever going to be caught 5 miles from nowhere in a rainstorm? Fair question. Most of us live pretty civilized lives these days. But think about it for a minute. How many times in the last few years have we seen the power grid fail? Roads wash out, cell towers go down. How often have perfectly normal people found themselves cut off from all the systems they depend on, even if it was just for a few hours? Hurricane Sandy left millions without power for weeks. The Texas freeze in 2021 turned modern homes into ice boxes overnight. Wildfires in California have forced entire communities to evacuate with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And that's just the big, headline-grabbing stuff. Every year, thousands of people get themselves into situations where the difference between a close call and a tragedy comes down to whether they know how to take care of themselves when the safety net disappears. Maybe you're hunting when an unexpected storm blows in. Maybe your car breaks down on a back road during a downpour. Maybe you're camping with the grandkids when what was supposed to be a gentle rain turns into something that has you seriously worried about flash floods. The skills we're talking about, the ability to read weather, choose safe ground, and build shelter that actually works. These aren't just for mountain men and survival enthusiasts. They're for any man who might find himself responsible for keeping himself and others alive when nature decides to remind us who's really in charge. The roadmap ahead. Over the next 7 parts, we're going to walk through exactly what happens when you find yourself caught in a serious storm with nothing but your wits and whatever materials nature provides. We'll start with the early warning signs, how to read the weather like your grandfather did, and why that first fat raindrop hitting your neck means you've got about 20 minutes to get serious about shelter. Then we'll talk about location, why what looks like perfect shelter to the untrained eye can be a death trap, and how to read terrain the way Depression-era hobos did when their lives depended on finding safe, dry ground. From there, we'll get into the nuts and bolts of construction, not the lightweight lean-to your scout leader taught you, but the kind of robust, weatherproof shelter that can keep you alive through a night that's trying its best to kill you. We'll cover what happens when that first wave of rain hits and you discover every gap and weakness in your hastily built refuge, how to reinforce and repair on the fly when visibility is near zero and every gust threatens to scatter your work to the wind. We'll talk about the long night, what really happens to your body when wet clothes meet cold air, and the psychological battle between panic and persistence that separates survivors from casualties. Then dawn, and the critical decisions that determine whether you walk out with a good story or end up needing rescue. How to assess damage, read conditions, and avoid the mistakes that happen when exhaustion clouds judgment. Finally, we'll cover what sticks with you afterward, the hard-earned lessons that transform weekend warriors into men who can handle whatever nature throws at them. The quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can take care of yourself and others when everything goes sideways. The stakes are real. This isn't about becoming some kind of mountain man or survival expert. It's about recovering a basic competence that used to be common knowledge, the kind of practical wisdom that let ordinary men handle extraordinary circumstances without breaking a sweat. Because here's the thing about storms, they don't ask if you're ready. They don't wait for convenient timing or check your schedule. They just roll in and test whatever skills you've got right here, right now. The men who do well in those tests aren't necessarily the ones with the most gear or the most experience. They're the ones who kept their heads, used what they had, and applied principles that work, whether you learned them in Boy Scouts or in the Army, on a farm or in a workshop. They're the ones who remembered that humans have been dealing with weather for thousands of years. And most of that time, we didn't have REI catalogs or weather apps. We had knowledge, resourcefulness, and the understanding that sometimes you have to work with what you've got instead of what you wish you had. Most importantly, they understood that when Mother Nature decides to test you, she doesn't grade on a curve. You either know what you're doing or you don't. You either build shelter that works or you spend a very long, very dangerous night learning why it doesn't. The good news is that the skills involved aren't rocket science. They're practical, logical, and based on principles you can learn and remember. The kind of knowledge that, once you have it, becomes part of who you are, ready when you need it, even if you hope you never do. So, let's get started. Because somewhere out there, the sky is getting dark, the wind is picking up, and a man is about to find out what he's really made of. The storm doesn't care about his schedule, his comfort level, or his previous experience. It only cares about one thing: whether he knows how to keep himself alive until morning. And right now, with those first fat raindrops starting to fall, he's got about 20 minutes to prove it. 3 hours before that first raindrop hits your neck, the weather's already telling you exactly what it plans to do. The problem is, most of us have forgotten how to listen. Your grandfather didn't have a smartphone in his pocket with hourly forecasts and radar loops. He had something better, a lifetime of watching the sky like his life depended on it. Because sometimes it did. The language of weather: walk outside right now and look up. What do you see? If you're like most folks, you see blue sky or clouds, maybe some wind, sunny, cloudy, or somewhere in between. That's about as detailed as it gets. But a man who spent his working life outdoors would see a story written across that same sky. He'd read the height and color of those clouds, the direction they're moving, how fast they're building or dissipating. He'd feel the humidity in the air, the direction of the wind, the way the temperature's been trending over the last hour. Most importantly, he'd notice when things started changing. I grew up next to a dairy farm, and old Frank, who ran it, could predict weather better than the evening news. Used to drive me crazy as a kid. He'd call off haying when the sky looked perfectly clear, or send us racing to get the last of the hay baled when I couldn't see a cloud anywhere. He was right every time. Years later, when I started paying attention, instead of just dismissing it as farmer superstition, I realized Frank was reading about 20 different indicators that I'd never even noticed. The way the cows clustered together before a storm, how the barn cats suddenly decided they needed to be indoors, the particular quality of stillness that settled over everything right before the wind shifted. But most telling of all was the smell. 3 hours before the first raindrops, Frank could smell weather coming. Not some mystical, sixth sense, just the ability to recognize what happens when a high-pressure system starts giving way to low pressure, when moisture begins building in the atmosphere, when the whole character of the air starts to change. The early warning system. Let's say you're 3 miles into a backcountry hike, or walking a property line, or maybe just exploring some state forest land on a Saturday afternoon. The forecast this morning called for partly cloudy skies and maybe a chance of light rain later. Nothing to worry about. Here's what you need to start watching for. The wind tells the story. Wind direction matters more than most people realize. When you left the house this morning, which way was the breeze blowing? Now, 3 hours later, has it shifted? In most parts of the country, weather moves from west to east, so when the wind starts backing around from south to southwest, then west, you're feeling the leading edge of a weather system that's still hours away from showing up on your horizon. But it's not just direction, it's behavior. Steady wind is usually steady weather. When the wind starts getting gusty, when it begins shifting direction every few minutes, when you notice periods of dead calm followed by sudden bursts, that's the atmosphere getting restless. Your grandfather would have called it unsettled. Meteorologists have fancier terms, but the meaning's the same. The air mass you're standing in is about to get shoved aside by something else, and that transition rarely happens gently. Barometric pressure without a barometer. You don't need instruments to feel air pressure dropping. Your body is an instrument. Ever notice how some people can predict rain because their joints ache? That's not folklore, that's physics. When atmospheric pressure drops, it affects the fluid in your joints, the pressure in your sinuses, even the way your ears feel. But there are external signs too. When air pressure starts falling, it affects everything around you. Birds feel it first. They'll start flying lower, staying closer to cover. If you see swallows or hawks flying unusually close to the ground, that's your canary in the coal mine. They're responding to pressure changes you can't feel yet. Smoke behaves differently too. Campfire smoke that was rising straight up this morning might start hanging closer to the ground, drifting instead of climbing. That's dense air moving in, the kind that comes with dropping pressure and building moisture. Even insects change their behavior. Bees head back to their hives earlier than usual. Mosquitoes and flies become more aggressive, more active. They're sensing the pressure drop and stocking up before the storm hits. The cloud story. This is where most people think they know what to look for, but they're usually reading the wrong chapter of the book. Those big, puffy cumulus clouds that look so harmless in children's books. When they start building vertically, instead of just drifting along, when their tops begin flattening out against the upper atmosphere, you're watching thunderstorms being born. But the real warning signs start earlier and subtler. High, thin clouds moving in from the west, cirrus clouds, though you don't need to know the name. Those are the scouts. They're ice crystals being pushed ahead of a weather front that might still be 6 to 8 hours away. When you start seeing those wispy, high-altitude streaks, especially if they're thickening and multiplying, it's time to start paying serious attention. The direction they're moving matters too. Clouds moving from different directions at different altitudes. High clouds coming from the southwest, while lower clouds drift in from the west. That's a sign of wind shear, of different air masses colliding. That collision is going to produce weather, and it probably won't be gentle. Temperature trends. Most people notice when it gets hot or cold, but they miss the subtle changes that really matter. A sudden drop in temperature, especially if it happens while the sun's still shining, means cool air is moving in fast. That cool air is denser than the warm air it's displacing, so it slides underneath and forces the warm air up rapidly. When warm, moist air gets forced up quickly, it condenses into clouds, and those clouds produce rain. But sometimes the opposite happens. The temperature might actually rise slightly right before a storm, as warm, moist air gets pulled in ahead of a cold front. That warm air carries more moisture, and when the cold front finally arrives and forces all that moisture up into the cooler atmosphere, well, that's when you get the kind of downpour that makes you question every decision that led to you being outdoors. The 20-minute warning. Here's where it gets critical. You've been watching the signs for hours. The shifting wind, the building clouds, the way the light has that particular quality that old-timers call weather light. You're not panicking, but you're paying attention. Then you feel it, that first fat raindrop. Not the fine mist that might just blow over. Not the light sprinkle that could go either way. That heavy, warm drop that hits your forehead and makes you look up at a sky that suddenly looks a lot more serious than it did 5 minutes ago. That's your 20-minute warning, maybe 30 if you're lucky, maybe 10 if you're not. From this moment, every decision you make matters. Where you are, which direction you're heading, what kind of shelter options you have around you. All of that needs to be assessed and decided quickly. Because Mother Nature just served you, notice that playtime is over. What happens next? I've talked to enough men who've been through this to know there are really only 2 types of responses. The first type starts looking around frantically, hoping to spot some obvious shelter, a cabin, a park pavilion, maybe a bridge or overpass. They're still thinking like consumers, looking for someone else's solution to their problem. The second type starts reading the terrain. They're looking at topography, drainage, wind patterns, available materials. They're not hoping for rescue, they're planning to rescue themselves. The difference between these 2 responses usually comes down to whether a man has ever had to solve a problem with his hands when failure wasn't an option. Maybe it was in the service, maybe on a construction site, maybe in a farm workshop where the nearest help was 20 miles away and the job had to get done regardless. Men who've been in those situations have a different relationship with problems. They don't waste time hoping someone else will solve it for them. They look at what they have, figure out what they need, and get to work. That's the mindset you need when those first drops start falling. Because hoping and wishing won't keep you dry, and panic sure won't help you think clearly about your options. Reading the terrain, like your life, depends on it. As those first drops multiply into a light sprinkle, you need to start seeing the landscape differently. Not as scenery, but as a collection of assets and liabilities. That gentle slope you're walking along, which direction does it drain? Where does the water go when it really starts coming down? Those rocks and fallen logs scattered around, are they solid enough to anchor a shelter? Are they positioned where you need them? Or would moving them make sense? That stand of trees up ahead, are they the right kind for what you're about to need? Dense enough to provide some wind protection, but not so thick that you can't work between them. Most importantly, where's the high ground? Not the highest point, that's where lightning likes to strike, but elevated enough that you won't be sleeping in a puddle, positioned so that runoff flows away from where you're planning to spend the night. These are the calculations your grandfather's generation made automatically. They'd been caught in enough weather to know that good intentions and poor positioning make for long, miserable nights. They'd learned to read landscape the way you read a road map, not as pretty scenery, but as information they could use. The psychological shift. Here's something nobody talks about. The moment when you realize you're not getting home tonight changes something fundamental in your head. It's like a switch flipping from inconvenience to survival mode. Some men handle that switch better than others. The ones who do well are usually the ones who've had practice solving problems under pressure, who've learned that panic burns energy you can't spare and clouds judgment you're going to need. They take a deep breath, look around, and start making a list. What do I have? What do I need? What can I improvise? How much time do I have before conditions get really bad? It's the same mental process you'd use for any other problem. Fixing a blown engine gasket when you're 50 miles from town, or getting the power restored when a tree takes out your electrical feed. You assess the situation, gather your resources, and get to work. The men who struggle are usually the ones who've never had to be completely self-reliant. They keep waiting for someone else to show up with a solution, or for the problem to somehow solve itself. But weather doesn't care about your comfort level or your previous experience. It's going to do what it's going to do on its timeline, according to its rules. Your job is to figure out how to work within those constraints. The sprinkle is getting heavier now, and the wind is picking up. You can hear it in the trees, not just rustling, but that more serious sound that means business. The light has that gray quality that says the sun won't be coming back out today. Time to stop reading signs and start making decisions. Because in about 15 minutes, what's currently a light rain is going to turn into something that will test every choice you make between now and then. The question isn't whether you can build perfect shelter with unlimited time and ideal materials. The question is whether you can build shelter that works with what you have in the time you've got left. And that clock is ticking faster than you might think. The rain's getting serious now, and you've got maybe 10 minutes before it becomes a real problem. This is when most people make the mistake that turns a tough night into a dangerous one. They grab the first shelter site that looks halfway decent and start building. Big mistake. Huge. Because location isn't just important, it's everything. Build the perfect shelter in the wrong spot, and you might as well have saved yourself the effort and just stood out in the rain. The seductive death trap. Let me paint you a picture that's gotten more people into trouble than any other scenario I know. You're walking along what used to be a creek bed, bone dry this time of year, maybe hasn't seen water in months. The sides rise up about 6 feet on either side, creating a natural windbreak. There are overhanging rocks, maybe some fallen logs. It's like nature built you a ready-made shelter, complete with walls and a partial roof. Perfect, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. Sometimes, literally. What you're looking at is a flash flood highway. Every drop of rain that falls for miles around is going to funnel into that innocent-looking creek bed. And when it does, that cozy natural shelter becomes a death trap with walls too steep to climb and water moving too fast to swim against. I remember talking to a search and rescue volunteer in Arizona who told me about pulling 3 different groups out of arroyos, dry creek beds, over the span of 2 summers. In every case, the weather had been clear where they were. The storms that created the flash floods were miles away, sometimes in completely different mountain ranges. They never saw it coming, he said. One minute they're setting up camp in what looks like the perfect spot. The next minute, they're dealing with a wall of water moving faster than they could run. The cruel irony is that these spots look so appealing because they are, in fact, natural shelters. That's exactly why water carved them in the first place. The rock formations, the overhangs, the natural windbreaks, all of that exists because water has been flowing through there for thousands of years. The fact that it's dry today doesn't change the fundamental geography. Reading water like a blueprint. Here's what you need to understand about water. It always wins. It's patient, persistent, and utterly indifferent to your plans. When the sky opens up, water is going to go where it wants to go, and everything else, including you, better get out of the way. So, before you even think about building shelter, you need to read the landscape like a hydrologist. Where does water come from? Where does it go? What happens when there's a lot of it moving fast? Start with the obvious stuff. Any kind of depression, gully, or low-lying area is potentially a water collection point. Even something that looks like just a gentle swale in the landscape can become a temporary river when enough rain falls fast enough. But the subtle indicators matter more. Look for signs of previous water flow. Debris caught in tree branches higher than your head, rocks that have been scoured clean, vegetation that's different in certain areas. That smooth patch of ground that looks so perfect for camping, it might be smooth because water regularly flows over it, carrying away anything that isn't nailed down. Pay attention to what the locals call widowmakers, dead trees or large branches that are hanging precariously overhead. They look stable in dry conditions, but add wind and water to the equation. And suddenly, that dead oak limb becomes a 1,000-pound projectile with your name on it. The high ground, advantage. Your grandfather's generation had a saying, when in doubt, go up. Not to the very top of the ridge, that's where lightning likes to play, but high enough that water flows away from you instead of toward you. This seems obvious, but you'd be amazed how many people ignore it when they're cold, wet, and focused on getting shelter built quickly. They see a flat spot that's easy to work with and start construction without thinking about what happens when that flat spot turns into a shallow lake. Elevation gives you more than just drainage. It usually means better visibility so you can see weather coming and spot potential hazards before they become immediate problems. It often provides better materials. Trees that have grown in more wind tend to drop stronger branches. Rocks on hillsides are usually more weathered and easier to work with. Most importantly, elevation gives you options. If conditions change, if your first shelter site proves inadequate, if you need to move for any reason, being high up, that means you can see alternative locations and routes. But, and this is crucial, there's a difference between good high ground and bad high ground. You want elevation, but you also want protection from wind. You want drainage, but you also want access to materials. You want visibility, but you don't want to be the tallest thing around when lightning starts looking for somewhere to strike. The materials assessment. Once you've found your spot, elevated enough for drainage, protected enough from wind, clear of obvious hazards, you need to take inventory of what you have to work with. This isn't a casual glance around. This is a methodical assessment of every resource within about a 50-foot radius of where you plan to build. Structural materials. Dead branches are your best friends, but not all dead branches are created equal. You want wood that's been dead long enough to lose most of its moisture, but not so long that it started to rot. Tap it with your knuckles. Solid dead wood sounds different than punky wood. It rings instead of thuds. Length matters, but diameter matters more. A 6-foot branch that's 3 inches thick will support a lot more weight than a 10-foot branch that's only an inch thick. You're going to need both. Long pieces for the framework, shorter pieces for cross-bracing and fill. Look for fallen logs that are still solid. These become your foundation elements, the pieces everything else anchors to. If you can roll it, it's probably light enough to move where you need it. If you can't budge it, you'll need to work around it or find a way to use it in place. Covering materials. This is where most people's shelter plans fall apart. They focus so much on building a frame that they forget they need something to keep the rain off that frame. In a perfect world, you'd have a tarp or some kind of waterproof fabric. In the real world, you're usually looking at bark, branches with leaves still attached, or anything else you can layer thick enough to shed water. Pine boughs are gold if you can find them. They shed water naturally, they're easy to work with, and they provide some insulation value too. Deciduous leaves work, but you need a lot of them, and they need to be layered properly, or they'll just become a soggy mess. Bark can be excellent if you can find large pieces that haven't started to curl and crack. Birch bark is legendary for good reason, but any large, intact pieces of bark can serve as natural shingles. Insulation. Here's what kills people in situations like this. They stay dry but lose so much body heat that hypothermia gets them anyway. Insulation, something to put between you and the cold, wet ground, isn't optional. Dry leaves, pine needles, grass, small branches, anything that creates dead airspace and keeps your body heat from being sucked away by direct contact with the ground. You need more than you think, a lot more. The rule of thumb is that you need about as much insulation under you as the ambient temperature difference between your body and the ground. If the ground is 50 degrees and your body is 98 degrees, that's roughly a 50-degree difference, which means you need enough insulation to maintain that gradient. In practical terms, that's usually at least a foot of material under your sleeping area, more if it's really cold or the ground is particularly wet. The time crunch, reality. Here's where theory meets reality. You're doing all this assessment and planning while the rain is getting heavier and the light is getting dimmer. Every minute you spend analyzing is a minute less you have for construction. This is where experience pays dividends. Men who've been caught in weather before develop an eye for sites that work and sites that don't. They can eliminate obvious bad options quickly and focus their time on the subtle differences between good and better. But if this is your first time playing this game, here's a shortcut. Eliminate anything obviously dangerous first, then pick the best of what's left. Perfect is the enemy of good enough, and good enough will keep you alive, while perfect might leave you standing in the rain, second-guessing yourself. The big mistakes to avoid don't build in any kind of depression or low spot, no matter how protected it looks. Water is smarter than you are, and it will find a way to get there. Don't build under dead trees or anywhere near what looks like unstable rock formations. Weather makes everything more dangerous, and you don't want to survive the rain only to get crushed by something that falls over. Don't build too close to live trees that might attract lightning, but don't build so far from any protection that wind becomes a major factor. Don't build where your shelter will be exposed to prevailing winds, but don't build in a spot so sheltered that air circulation becomes a problem. Most importantly, don't build anywhere you can't quickly escape if conditions change. Always have a route out that doesn't depend on perfect conditions. The Depression era, wisdom. During the Great Depression, when millions of men were riding the rails looking for work, they developed an informal but sophisticated system for evaluating potential shelter sites. These weren't outdoorsmen or survival experts, just regular guys who needed to stay alive, sleeping rough in all kinds of weather. They learned to look for what they called hobo-friendly locations, spots that offered protection without being obvious traps, places where you could build something that would work without attracting unwanted attention, sites that had escape routes if troubles, weather or otherwise, developed. Their wisdom boiled down to a simple set of priorities: drainage first, materials second, protection from wind third. Everything else was luxury. Drainage first because being wet all night could kill you. Materials second because you can't build shelter from good intentions. Protection from wind third because wind will steal your body heat faster than cold air alone. These men learned these lessons the hard way, night after night, season after season. They couldn't afford to make the same mistake twice because the second mistake might be their last. What you can see from here, the rain's coming down steady now, and that wind is really starting to howl. You found your spot, elevated enough for good drainage, protected from the worst of the wind, with decent materials within working distance. But now comes the hard part, building something that will actually work. Not just something that looks like shelter, but something that will keep you alive and reasonably dry through what's shaping up to be a very long night. Because here's the thing about makeshift shelters. They're only as good as their weakest point. Get the location right, gather good materials, but make one critical construction mistake, and you'll spend the night learning exactly where you went wrong. The storm doesn't care about your good intentions or your partial success. It only cares about whether your shelter works or it doesn't, whether you stay dry or you don't, whether you maintain your core body temperature or you don't. And right now, with the rain picking up and the temperature starting to drop, you're about to find out which side of those equations you're going to be on. Time to get to work. Because talking about shelter building is one thing. Actually making it work when the weather's doing its best to stop you is something else entirely. The rain's getting serious now, and you've got your location picked out. Time to build. But here's where most people's survival fantasies crash into cold, wet reality. That lean-to your scout leader taught you 30 years ago isn't going to cut it, not even close. See, there's a world of difference between building a shelter for a merit badge on a sunny Saturday afternoon and building something that will actually keep you alive when Mother Nature's throwing everything she's got at you. Why the Scout Manual shelter will kill you. Let's be honest about what most of us think we know about emergency shelter. You find a couple of trees, lean some branches against them at an angle, pile some leaves on top, and call it good. Maybe add a few rocks to hold everything in place. That works fine for about 20 minutes of light drizzle. When you're dealing with hours of driving rain, wind gusts that can knock a grown man sideways, and temperatures dropping toward hypothermic levels, that Boy Scout lean-to becomes a cruel joke. Here's what happens to that textbook shelter when real weather hits. The wind gets under those loosely laid branches and scatters them like matchsticks. The rain runs right through your single layer of leaves and starts pooling underneath you. The whole structure, which looked so solid when you built it, turns into a pile of wet debris that provides about as much protection as standing under a basketball hoop. I remember talking to a guy who spent 22 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. He told me about a training exercise where they had to build emergency shelters and then actually sleep in them during a spring thunderstorm. Half the guys built what they remembered from Boy Scouts, he said. The other half built something that looked like it could handle whatever weather threw at it. Guess which group got any sleep that night? The difference wasn't materials. Everybody had access to the same forest. The difference was understanding what they were really trying to accomplish. The engineering reality. When you're building shelter that actually has to work, you're not just putting up walls and a roof. You're creating a system that has to solve multiple problems simultaneously. Problem 1, water management rain doesn't just fall straight down. It blows sideways. It bounces off surfaces. It runs along branches and drips off the ends. It finds every gap, every weak point, every place where two materials don't quite meet properly. Your shelter needs to shed water, not just block it. That means surfaces angled steep enough that water runs off instead of soaking through. It means overlapping materials like shingles on a roof, so water hits one layer and runs down to the next without finding gaps to leak through. Most importantly, it means thinking in 3 dimensions. Water that runs off your roof has to go somewhere. If that somewhere is directly onto your sleeping area, you've just built yourself an expensive way to get soaked. Problem 2, wind resistance. Wind doesn't just blow against your shelter. It tries to get underneath it, lift it up, and tear it apart. Every loose end, every unsecured edge, every piece that's not properly anchored becomes a failure point when the gusts really start howling. You need structures that are not just heavy enough to resist wind, but designed so that wind pressure actually makes them stronger, not weaker. Think about how a traditional barn is built. Those big timber frames aren't just strong. They're designed so that the forces trying to knock them down actually get redirected into the foundation. Problem 3, structural integrity. Your shelter needs to support not just its own weight, but the added weight of water soaking into all those materials, plus wind loads, plus whatever debris might blow into it during the storm. That means joints that actually hold under stress, bracing that prevents the whole thing from racking sideways when the wind hits it from an unexpected direction. Foundation elements that are solid enough to keep everything anchored when conditions get ugly. The real-world construction method. Forget everything you think you know about building emergency shelters. We're going to build this thing like it matters, because it does. Start with the foundation. Find the biggest, most solid objects in your construction area. Fallen logs, large rocks, anything that's heavy enough that wind won't move it, and stable enough to build on. These become your anchor points. If you've got a choice between two decent anchor points that are close together and two great anchor points that are farther apart, take the close ones. In weather like this, bigger isn't always better if it means your structure becomes too large to build properly with the time and materials you have. Position these foundation elements to create a space just big enough for you to lie down with a little room to move around. Don't get ambitious and try to build a palace. You're not trying to win an architecture award. You're trying to stay alive. Build the frame like you mean it. Now you need structural elements, the main poles and cross pieces that everything else will attach to. This is where most people go wrong. They grab whatever's handy and hope it'll work. You need pieces that are long enough to span your shelter space with some overlap for connections. But more importantly, you need pieces that are strong enough to handle the loads they're going to carry. Here's a quick field test. If you can snap a branch over your knee, it's probably not strong enough to be a primary structural element. If you can bend it significantly with moderate pressure, it's going to fail when weather puts real stress on it. You're looking for dead wood that's been seasoned, dry enough to be light, but not so old that it's started to rot. Living branches can work, but they're heavier and harder to work with. Completely rotten wood is useless. It'll break under load when you need it most. Create real joints. This is where most emergency shelters fall apart, literally. People just lean pieces against each other and hope friction will hold everything together. Friction won't hold anything when wind starts pushing and rain starts adding weight. You need joints that actually lock pieces together. The simplest is a notch joint. Use a rock or your knife to cut a notch in one piece of wood that another piece can sit in, not just a scratch, a real notch that creates mechanical interference so the pieces can't separate without lifting one clear of the other. For longer pieces that need to overlap, wrap them together with whatever cordage you have. Don't have rope? Strip bark from birch or basswood trees. It's surprisingly strong when twisted together. Even tough grass can work if you braid it properly. The goal is to create connections that actually resist the forces that are going to try to pull your shelter apart. Every joint should be strong enough that you could pick up the whole structure by that connection point without it failing. Layer the weather barrier. Now comes the part that actually keeps you dry. And here's the critical insight. One layer of anything isn't enough. You need multiple layers properly overlapped, with each layer doing a specific job. Start with the steepest angle you can create, 45 degrees minimum if you want water to run off instead of soaking through. Steeper is better if you can manage it without making the structure unstable. First layer, your largest, most water-resistant materials. Big pieces of bark, sections of fallen tree with the bark still on, anything that can shed water over a large area. These go on first, positioned to overlap like shingles. Second layer, smaller materials that fill gaps and add thickness. Pine boughs work great here if you can find them. Bundles of long grass or reeds. Even just more small branches, as long as they're positioned to shed water downward. Third layer, fine materials that plug the remaining holes and add insulation. Leaves, pine needles, moss, anything that creates dead airspace while still allowing water to run off. The key is overlap. Every piece should overlap the piece below it by at least a third of its length. Water should never be able to run straight through. It should hit one layer, run down to the next, hit that layer, run down to the next, and so on until it reaches the ground, well away from your sleeping area. The critical details that matter. Drainage. Remember that water running off your roof has to go somewhere. Dig a small trench around your shelter to direct that water away from your foundation. It doesn't have to be deep, 6 inches is usually enough, but it needs to slope away from your structure. If you're on any kind of hill, pay attention to water coming from upslope. A small channel directing water around your shelter area can be the difference between staying dry and waking up in a puddle. Ventilation. Here's something counterintuitive. You need airflow, even in a rainstorm. Seal yourself up completely, and you'll create condensation problems that can soak you as thoroughly as rain would. Leave a gap somewhere, usually at the downslope end of your shelter, that allows air to move through without letting rain blow in. This keeps humidity down and prevents that clammy, suffocating feeling that comes with poor air circulation. The door that isn't don't build a doorway. Build an entrance that you can seal from the inside. Could be as simple as a section of your wall that's loose enough to move aside when you want to get in or out, but secure enough to hold fast against wind and rain when you're hunkered down inside. The last thing you want is a permanent opening that wind and rain can use to attack your shelter from the inside. What separates success from disaster? I've seen two groups of people build emergency shelters with identical materials in identical conditions. One group stayed reasonably dry and got some sleep. The other group spent the night shivering in what amounted to a slightly organized pile of wet debris. The difference wasn't skill or experience, it was attitude. The successful group approached the job like they were building something that had to work. They took time to make proper joints. They tested each connection as they built it. They thought through what would happen when wind and water started testing their construction. The unsuccessful group approached it like they were going through the motions of building a shelter. They knew what emergency shelters were supposed to look like, so they built something that looked right. But they didn't think about whether it would actually function when conditions got tough. Build it like you're going to live in it because you are. For the next 8 to 12 hours, this pile of sticks and leaves is your house. It's the thing standing between you and hypothermia, between getting some rest and spending all night fighting to stay warm. Every joint you make, every piece you position, every layer you add, do it like your life depends on it, because it might. Test everything as you build. Shake the frame to see if the joints hold. Pour water on a section of roof to see if it actually sheds rain or just lets it through. Put your full weight on structural elements to make sure they won't collapse when you need them most. The final touch, your ground game. All the weatherproofing in the world won't help you if you're lying directly on cold, wet ground. You need insulation underneath you, a lot of it. Gather every dry organic material you can find within a reasonable distance of your shelter. Leaves, pine needles, grass, small twigs, strips of bark, anything that will create dead airspace between you and the ground. You want at least a foot of this material, more if you can manage it. It's going to compress when you lie on it. So what looks like way too much when you're gathering, it will be just about right when you actually need it. Layer it thick, and then add more. Because once you're inside your shelter and the storm is really cutting loose, you won't be going back out to gather more insulation. What you have is what you get. The rain's really coming down now, and the wind is starting to make that serious sound. That means business. Your shelter is as ready as you can make it, with the materials you had and the time you had to work with. Now comes the real test. Not how it looks, but how it works when nature starts trying its best to tear it apart. The storm doesn't ease into it. One minute you're putting the finishing touches on your shelter, congratulating yourself on a job well done, and the next minute the sky opens up like someone tore a hole in a water tank. This is the moment of truth. Everything you've built, every decision you've made, every joint you've secured or failed to secure, it's all about to be tested by an examiner that doesn't give partial credit. The sound of everything going wrong. You know that sound when you're working under the hood of a car and you hear something important break? That metallic snap that tells you your afternoon just got a lot more complicated? Weather makes a similar sound when your shelter starts failing. It's not dramatic. No movie soundtrack, no thunder crash at the exact moment of disaster. It's usually something subtle, a slight shift in the way wind sounds against your roof, a new dripping sound that wasn't there 5 minutes ago. The soft crack of wood giving way under loads it wasn't built to handle. I remember talking to a guy who'd been through ranger school, spent 2 tours walking the mountains of Afghanistan. He told me about a night when his unit had to hunker down in improvised shelters during a storm that lasted 14 hours. The guys who made it through the night comfortable were the ones who heard those little sounds and did something about them right away, he said. The guys who had a rough night were the ones who figured those little problems would sort themselves out. They never do. Little problems become big problems, and big problems become life-threatening emergencies. All while you're trapped inside a space barely big enough to sit up in, with weather conditions outside that make repairs nearly impossible. The first failure points. When the rain really starts coming down and the wind starts gusting, your shelter is going to fail somewhere. Count on it. The question isn't whether it will fail, but where and whether you can fix it before that failure cascades into total structural collapse. Water always finds the weak spots. Remember that section of roof where two pieces of bark didn't quite overlap the way you wanted, but you figured it was close enough? Water remembers it too. Rain has a way of finding every gap, every poorly fitted joint, every place where you got lazy or ran out of time. What seemed like minor imperfections when you were building suddenly become major problems when there's real water pressure behind them. The first drops coming through aren't the problem. The problem is that those drops are carrying information. They're showing water exactly where the gaps are. Within minutes, what started as an occasional drip becomes a steady stream, and that stream starts eroding whatever materials you use to try to fill that gap. Wind loads. You didn't calculate when you were building. The wind was annoying, but manageable. You could work around it, compensate for it. Now that the storm is really ramping up, you're discovering that wind doesn't just push against things. It gets sneaky. It finds ways to get underneath your roof and lift it up. It creates pressure differentials that try to suck walls inward or blow them outward. It grabs loose ends and uses them like handles to tear apart joints that seemed solid when you built them. Most dangerous of all, it brings debris. That branch that's been hanging loose in a tree 50 yards away suddenly becomes a battering ram aimed at your carefully constructed shelter. Pine cones, leaves, small rocks, anything that can become airborne becomes ammunition in wind strong enough to knock you off your feet. The domino effect. Here's the really insidious part. Failures cascade. One loose piece lets water in, which soaks surrounding materials, which makes them heavier and weaker. A joint that was marginal when dry becomes completely inadequate when wet, or wind gets hold of one unsecured edge and uses it to peel back a whole section of roofing. Suddenly you've got a gaping hole where there used to be weather protection, and every raindrop that comes through that hole starts working to make it bigger. The shelter that looked solid and weatherproof 20 minutes ago can disintegrate with shocking speed once the failure process starts. And it always starts with something small, something you could have fixed easily if you'd caught it in time. Field repairs in hell. This is where you find out what you're really made of. Your shelter is failing, the storm is getting worse, and you need to fix problems in conditions that make simple tasks nearly impossible. Working in the dark. Even if it's daytime, the storm makes everything darker. Heavy clouds, driving rain, limited visibility. You're essentially working by feel, trying to diagnose and repair structural problems you can barely see. You learn to work with your hands like a blind man, following joints by touch, testing connections by feel, identifying materials by texture. That smooth piece is probably bark, the rough piece is probably wood, the stringy stuff is probably some kind of fiber you can use for lashing. Your sense of spatial relationships becomes critical. Where is that loose piece in relation to the rest of the structure? Which way does this joint need to move to lock properly? How can you get leverage on something when you can't even see exactly where it is? Everything is heavier. When wet materials that were easy to handle when you were building become awkward, slippery, and heavy when they're saturated with water, that piece of bark that you could flip into position with one hand now requires both hands and careful positioning to keep it from sliding off the framework. Wet wood becomes not just heavier, but more fragile. It splits differently, breaks in unexpected ways. Joints that held fine when the materials were dry start failing as everything swells and changes shape. Even your own clothes become obstacles. Wet fabric clings, restricts movement, makes every action take more energy. Gloves become slippery and clumsy. Rain runs down your sleeves every time you reach above your head. The comfort zone is gone. When you were building in relatively calm conditions, you could take your time, think through problems, maybe even step back and assess your work. Now you're operating in crisis mode, making quick decisions with incomplete information while fighting conditions that are actively working against you. This is where training kicks in, not formal survival training necessarily, but the kind of experience that comes from fixing things under pressure. Maybe it was repairing equipment in military conditions where failure wasn't an option. Maybe it was emergency repairs on farm machinery when the weather window was closing fast. Maybe it was troubleshooting problems in a workshop where you had to work with what you had instead of what you wished you had. The mindset is the same. Assess quickly, act decisively, and keep working until the problem is solved. Because stopping isn't an option. Korean War lessons in emergency engineering. The Korean War taught a generation of American soldiers how to build things that worked in impossible conditions. Not pretty things, not permanent things, but functional things that could be constructed quickly with whatever materials were available. One veteran told me about a night when his unit had to reinforce failing shelters during a storm that brought 36 hours of freezing rain. Visibility was near zero, temperatures were dropping toward hypothermic levels, and they were working with materials they'd scrounged from a bombed-out village. "We learned that you don't fix the whole problem at once," he said. "You fix the worst part first, then the next worst part, then the next, and you do whatever works, whether it looks right or not." That became the survival principle. Stop the worst leak first. Shore up the weakest joint first. Reinforce the most critical failure point first. Worry about elegance and proper technique after you've stopped the immediate threats. Triage thinking. When multiple things are going wrong simultaneously, and they will, you need to prioritize like a medic triaging casualties. What's the most dangerous failure? What's likely to get worse fastest? What can you afford to ignore for the next hour while you deal with more critical problems? That drip in the corner might be annoying, but the section of roof that's starting to sag under water weight is a structural emergency. That loose piece of siding might be flapping in the wind, but the joint that's working loose on your main support beam could bring down the whole shelter. Fix the catastrophic problems first. Everything else can wait until you've stabilized the structure enough to survive the night. Redundancy and backup systems. Professional engineers build redundancy into critical systems, multiple ways for the same job to get done, so that if one method fails, others can take over. You need the same thinking in emergency shelter repair. If a joint is failing, don't just try to fix that joint. Add a backup connection that can carry the load if the primary connection fails completely. If a section of roof is leaking, don't just patch the leak. Add another layer that can shed water even if the patch doesn't hold. Think like you're expecting things to get worse, because they probably will. Every repair you make should include a plan for what happens if that repair fails at 3 in the morning when conditions are at their worst. The psychological battle. Here's what nobody tells you about emergency shelter repairs. Half the battle is mental. When things start going wrong in rapid succession, when every fix reveals 2 new problems, when the storm seems to be getting stronger instead of weaker, it's easy to slip into despair. You start thinking maybe you should have just stayed out in the rain. Maybe this makeshift shelter is more dangerous than being completely exposed. Maybe you've just trapped yourself in a situation that's going to collapse on top of you. Combat the panic. Panic burns energy you can't spare and clouds judgment you desperately need. When you feel it starting to creep in, force yourself to slow down and work methodically. One problem at a time, one repair at a time. Don't think about the 8 things that need fixing. Think about the one thing you can fix right now with the materials you have and the time you have available. Breathe deliberately, work steadily. Save the emotional reaction for later, when you're safe and dry and have the luxury of processing what you've been through. Focus on what you can control. You can't control the weather. You can't make it stop raining or blowing. You can't make the temperature more comfortable or the visibility better. But you can control your response to the weather. You can work systematically through problems. You can use your brain instead of just reacting emotionally to each new crisis. Most importantly, you can remember that thousands of people have been through situations like this and lived to tell about it. The storm feels overwhelming because you're in the middle of it, but it's not supernatural. It's just weather, and weather always passes. Making it through the crisis. The rain is horizontal now, driven by wind that sounds like a freight train when it hits the trees around your shelter. Lightning is starting to make the whole world strobe. This isn't just uncomfortable, it's genuinely dangerous. But your shelter is holding. Not perfectly. There are leaks and weak spots and places where you can feel the whole structure flexing under the load. But it's holding. You've patched the worst leaks. You've reinforced the connections that were starting to fail. You've added redundant supports where the load seemed too much for the original construction. Most importantly, you've proven something to yourself. When things started going wrong, you didn't panic. You got to work. You solved problems under pressure with limited materials and unlimited stakes. The storm is far from over. You've got hours more of this ahead of you, and there will be more failures, more emergency repairs, more moments when you wonder if the whole thing is going to come apart. But you've survived the first wave. You've learned what your shelter can handle and what it can't. You've developed a feel for how it responds to different kinds of stress. Now comes the real test. The long night. Hours of defending what you've built against weather that never gets tired, never gives up, and never stops looking for new ways to find your weaknesses. Because the storm isn't done with you yet, not even close.